She forgot her umbrella, and a billionaire invited her into his armored limousine. The city was a symphony of distant sirens and the relentless thrum of unseen machinery, a sound Alastair Finch usually found orderly. From his penthouse office, 60 floors above the grimy ballet of rush hour, the chaos looked like a predictable, albeit messy, algorithm. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, not admiring the bruised twilight sky, but dissecting the flow of headlights, each a data point in the sprawling metropolis he felt he indirectly controlled. His suit, a bespoke charcoal armor, felt less like clothing and more like a second skin, one that never wrinkled, never betrayed a flicker of the man beneath. "The sterling acquisition is complete, Mr. Finch." A disembodied voice, that of his ever-efficient AI assistant Kale, intoned from a hidden speaker. "Shares are up 7-8% pre-market." Alistair's lips thinned, a micro-expression that could pass for satisfaction. "Casualties?" Sterling's CEO and 2 board members have tendered resignations. Projected redundancies in their mid-management tier are substantial. "Efficient," Alistair murmured, the word devoid of any emotion save a clinical approval. He turned from the window, the city lights casting long, predatory shadows across the expansive, minimalist room. Everything was glass, steel and monochrome, a reflection of the man who inhabited it. No personal photographs, no sentimental clutter. Only a single, starkly beautiful Brancusi sculpture on a pedestal. Its polished bronze gleamed the only hint of warmth, if one could call it that. It was an investment like everything else. His world was one of calculated moves, leveraged buyouts, and the silent, brutal efficiency of capital. Human connection was a variable too unpredictable, too prone to messy, unprofitable emotions. His last significant attempt at it, a marriage that had ended in a painfully public and financially draining divorce, had taught him that trust was a commodity he couldn't afford. The prenup had been ironclad, but the emotional shrapnel had taken years to sweep away, or rather, to bury under thicker layers of work and detachment. His Farida wasn't a scar. It was a meticulously constructed fortress around a void, a place where vulnerability had once lived and been summarily executed. Wealth hadn't just amplified his isolation, it had become its primary architect. He glanced at the antique Jaeger LeCoultre on his wrist. Time for the Global Finance Summit reception. Another performance. He straightened his tie, the silk cool beneath his fingers. Another night of glad-handing, of feigning interest in the sycophantic pronouncements of lesser titans, of navigating the subtle power plays that were the lifeblood of his sphere. His real desire? To retreat to his soundproofed library with market reports and a glass of prohibitively expensive single-malt scotch, the only companion whose demands were predictable. Miles away, in a small, cluttered studio smelling faintly of turpentine, linseed oil, and old paper, Clara Holloway squinted at the delicate tracery of cracks on a 17th-century portrait. Her tongue poked out from the corner of her mouth in concentration, a smudge of ochre paint like a tiny war stripe on her cheek. Rain hammered against the grimy atelier window, a relentless drumming counterpoint to the quiet hiss of her fine-tipped brush, applying a consolidating agent. Clara's world was one of patience, of gentle coaxing, of breathing life back into forgotten beauty. She was an art restorer, working on a freelance basis for museums that couldn't afford full-time staff and private collectors who appreciated her meticulous, almost reverent touch. Her status quo was a constant juggling act of passion projects that barely paid the bills and the gnawing anxiety of making rent on her tiny apartment. But when she was immersed in her work, like now, tracing the faint smile of a long-dead countess, the anxieties receded. Here, there was meaning, a connection to history, a tangible contribution. Her deseo was simple: to save these fragile pieces of human expression from the ravages of time, to allow their stories to continue. Her failure, if it could be called that, was a certain impracticality, an occasional forgetfulness born of intense focus on the task at hand. Today it was her umbrella, left hooked over the back of her chair at the underfunded city archive, where she'd had spent the morning researching pigment compositions. A sigh escaped her as she carefully set down her brush. The Countess would have to wait. She was already late to meet her friend Sarah, and the downpour showed no signs of abating. She quickly tidied her workspace, a small act of order in her generally chaotic but beloved environment. Her wealth was in the richness of her inner life, the satisfaction of her craft, but it didn't keep the rain off. She glanced at her worn satchel, double-checking for her keys and wallet, then grabbed her coat, a slightly too large hand-me-down that smelled of damp wool. Stepping out of the old building that housed her studio, the ferocity of the storm hit her full force. It wasn't just rain. It was a biblical deluge, wind whipping icy sheets of water sideways, instantly plastering her dark hair to her forehead. The streetlights cast blurry haloed reflections on the slick pavement, and the few unfortunate souls caught out were hunched figures scurrying for non-existent shelter. Clara pulled her coat tighter, a grimace on her face. The bus stop was a good 10-minute walk, and by the time she reached it, she'd be a drowned rat. She took a deep breath, ready to make a dash for it, when a sleek, black behemoth of a car glided silently to a halt beside her. It was less a car and more a moving vault, its tinted windows reflecting the stormy streetscape like obsidian mirrors. An armored limousine, completely out of place in this slightly shabby artistic neighborhood. The back window hummed down a few inches, revealing nothing but deeper shadow within. Then a voice, calm and low, with an edge of something unplaceable authority perhaps, or weariness. You appear to be inadequately prepared for the current atmospheric conditions. Clara, startled, took a half-step back. She could just make out the silhouette of a man inside. "Oh, yes. I seem to have forgotten my umbrella," she managed, rain dripping from her nose. There was a pause. Then, "That is unfortunate. I am heading downtown. If that aligns with your trajectory, I can offer you a reprieve from the storm." Clara hesitated. This was a scene from a movie, not her life. Getting into a stranger's armored limousine? Her mother's warnings about talking to strangers echoed faintly, but the rain was relentless, turning colder, and the thought of the sodden, miserable bus ride was deeply unappealing. "That's very kind of you," she said, peering towards the window, trying to gauge the unseen occupant. "Are you sure?" "It would be inefficient for you to contract pneumonia," the voice stated flatly. The door clicked open with a solid, expensive-sounding thunk. This was the call to adventure, or at least to a very dry ride. Clara, shivering, made a split-second decision. Efficiency, it seemed, was on her side. She clutched her satchel and ducked into the opulent, silent interior of the limousine. The door closed with a soft, pneumatic hiss, sealing out the storm's fury as if it were a distant rumor. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the rain had been. The interior of the limousine was vast, upholstered in creamy leather that smelled faintly of itself and something else, something sterile and expensive. Subdued lighting glowed from recessed panels, illuminating a space that felt more like a private jet cabin than a car. Clara found herself sitting opposite the man, Alistair Finch, though she didn't know his name yet. He was an imposing figure, even in the dim light. His features were sharp, patrician, his dark hair impeccably cut. He regarded her with an unnervingly steady gaze, his eyes a cool, assessing grey. There was no warmth in them, merely a detached curiosity, like a biologist observing a new specimen. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice a little breathless. She tried to subtly wring some water from the hem of her coat. "You've saved me from a thorough drenching." Alistair inclined his head. a minimal gesture. My driver, Peterson, will take you wherever you need to go, within reason. He was already turning his attention to a sleek tablet that emerged from a hidden compartment, his attempt to control the situation by retreating into his familiar world of data and distance. This was, in his mind, a transaction concluded. He had offered a service. It had been accepted. End of interaction. Clara, however, wasn't so easily dismissed, not out of boldness, but out of a genuine, if slightly flustered, sense of gratitude. I'm meeting a friend near the City Art Museum, if that's not too far out of your way. He didn't look up from his tablet. Peterson knows the city. An awkward silence descended, broken only by the whisper-quiet hum of the engine and the rhythmic swish of the wipers, now a muted sound from within their insulated cocoon. Clara felt a flush creep up her neck. She was acutely aware of her damp clothes, her slightly disheveled appearance, in stark contrast to his immaculate tailoring and the sheer luxury surrounding them. She wasn't intimidated by wealth itself. She'd worked for enough wealthy collectors to be unfazed by opulence, but the man's aura was different. It was a shield of impenetrable reserve. She stole a glance at him. He was scrolling through what looked like complex financial charts, his expression unreadable. She wondered what kind of person owned an armored limousine. A politician? A celebrity? He didn't have the look of either. There was a severity to him, a coiled tension beneath the stillness. To break the silence and perhaps to assert her own small presence in this overwhelming space, she said, "It's quite a storm. It came on so suddenly." He made a non-committal sound, still focused on his screen. Clara tried again, her gaze drawn to the smooth, polished wood paneling. "This is an incredible vehicle. The craftsmanship is remarkable." She wasn't just making polite conversation. She had an eye for detail, for the artistry in well-made things. This time he did look up, a flicker of surprise in his grey eyes. It wasn't the comment itself, but perhaps the sincerity in her tone, the fact that she'd commented on craftsmanship rather than the obvious display of wealth. "It serves its purpose," he said, his voice neutral. "Which is?" Clara asked, then immediately wished she hadn't. It sounded impertinent. A ghost of a smile, so faint it was barely there, touched his lips. "To provide a secure and efficient environment." "Efficient seems to be your favorite word," she observed, a hint of gentle teasing in her voice, surprising herself. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but as if he were re-evaluating her. Most people who found themselves in his orbit were either fawning or terrified. Her simple, direct manner was unexpected. "It is a useful concept," he conceded. Traffic, predictably, was snarled due to the weather. The limousine inched forward, the journey stretching longer than either had anticipated. This forced proximity was the unexpected variable in Alistair's controlled equation. He found his attention drifting from the glowing screen of his tablet to the woman opposite him. She wasn't conventionally beautiful in the high-gloss, sculpted way of the women who usually moved in his circles. But there was an intelligence in her dark eyes, a quiet vibrancy about her, even damp and slightly out of her element. She wasn't trying to impress him, or flirt with him, or ask him for anything. She was just present. "You work near the City Art Museum?" he asked, the question surprising him as much as it did her. He rarely engaged in idle chit-chat. Clara brightened. "I'm an art restorer. I sometimes consult for them. Today, I was hoping to see the new Vermeer exhibit before meeting my friend, but the archive ran late." She gestured to her satchel, full of notes on 17th-century binding techniques, probably not as exciting as whatever is on your tablet. Alistair glanced at his screen, then back at her. "Vermeer," he said, a note of something unreadable in his voice. He owned two, sequestered in a climate-controlled vault in Geneva, acquisitions he rarely visited but knew, down to the decimal point their appreciating value. He wondered if she would see them as assets or as art. a master of light and shadow, Clara added, her eyes lighting up. The way he captures intimacy in everyday moments. It's like looking through a keyhole into another time. So much emotion conveyed in a single glance, a hand gesture. Her passion was unfeigned, a stark contrast to the calculated pronouncements he usually heard in discussions of art, which typically revolved around provenance and auction prices. He found himself listening, really listening. It was a novel sensation. Emotion, he repeated, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. An unreliable narrator. Clara tilted her head. Perhaps, but isn't it what makes us human? What gives art its power to connect us across centuries, despite all our efficiencies? There was a gentle challenge in her tone now, a quiet confidence. She wasn't arguing, but offering a different perspective. Alistair felt a strange, unfamiliar stirring within him, a faint crack in the icy facade he'd so carefully constructed. Her words, her earnestness, were like a sliver of unexpected warmth. He had built an empire on logic, on the predictable, on the quantifiable. She spoke of things that couldn't be measured or controlled, yet held undeniable value. As the limousine finally neared the museum, the rain had softened to a drizzle. Peterson, the driver, a silent, stoic man Alistair had employed for over a decade, cleared his throat softly. "City Art Museum, sir." Alistair looked at Clara. The moment felt incomplete. He, who abhorred loose ends and inefficiencies, found himself reluctant to simply let this encounter end. It was an impulse, irrational and uncharacteristic. "I have a modest collection myself," he said, the words coming out before he could analyze their strategic merit. "Some pieces you might find interesting." He paused. "If your schedule ever permits." Clara looked surprised. Then a genuine smile lit her face, transforming her features, making her almost beautiful. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Finch," he supplied. "Alistair Finch." He reached into his breast pocket and retrieved a slim obsidian card, offering it to her. His name, nothing else. No title, no company. Those who needed to know knew. She took it, her fingers brushing his briefly. A tiny, unexpected spark. "Clara Holloway, it's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Finch, and thank you again for the rescue." "The pleasure," Alistair found himself saying, and was surprised to find he almost meant it, "was mine, Miss Holloway." As she stepped out of the limousine, turning to give him one last smile before disappearing towards the museum's grand entrance, Alistair watched her go. The city lights reflected in the damp pavement, and for a moment they didn't look like data points. They looked almost beautiful. Peterson's voice came from the front, carefully neutral. "To the summit, sir?" Alistair leaned back against the leather. The tablet lay forgotten on the seat beside him. He felt a subtle shift within, a loosening of some tightly wound spring. He had crossed a threshold, not just by offering a stranger a ride, but by allowing a flicker of genuine human interaction to penetrate his armored world. He didn't know what it meant or where it might lead. He only knew that the meticulously ordered landscape of his existence suddenly felt less predictable and, strangely, less empty. "Peterson," Alistair said, his voice a shade softer than usual. "Divert to the penthouse. The summit can wait." This was the first crossing. He had chosen, however impulsively, a deviation from his rigidly scheduled life. He was going to look at his own art collection, something he hadn't done with any real attention in years. And he was going to think about Clara Holloway, the woman who had forgotten her umbrella and in doing so had brought an unexpected and unsettling variable into his perfectly controlled equation. The invitation, when it came a few days later, was as understated and potent as Alistair Finch himself, a simple, heavy cream card with a time and date delivered by a discreet courier. to view the Finch collection. No effusive pleasantries, just an expectation. Clara felt a flutter of nerves mixed with undeniable curiosity. Alistair S. Penthouse was less a home and more a statement, a fortress of glass and steel perched atop one of the city's tallest skyscrapers, commanding breathtaking, almost unnerving views. Mr. Pembroke, a butler of advanced years with an impeccably stoic demeanor and eyes that missed nothing, greeted her at the private elevator. His presence was a subtle reminder of the immense, well-oiled machine that ran Alistair Finch's life. The art was, as expected, museum quality. Degas dancers frozen in ethereal motion, a brooding Rothko that seemed to swallow the light, a sharp, unsettling bacon, but it was displayed with a curious lack of personal touch, each piece perfectly lit, perfectly placed, yet somehow sterile, like exhibits in a very exclusive, very private gallery. Alistair himself was a study in controlled charisma. He led her through the rooms, his commentary sparse but insightful, focusing on provenance, on artistic innovation, on investment value. He was testing her, Clara realized, gauging her reactions, perhaps looking for the sycophancy he was so accustomed to. This Monet, he gestured towards a shimmering depiction of water lilies, is projected to appreciate by 12% annually for the next decade. Clara looked at the painting, truly looked. "It's beautiful," she said softly, "but it feels sad here." Alistair raised an eyebrow. Sad? "It's a painting of light, of nature, of fleeting moments. It needs air, sunlight, not just spotlights." She hesitated, then plunged on. "It's like a magnificent bird in a gilded cage, Mr. Finch, exquisite, but not truly alive." A silence fell, thick and heavy. Clara inwardly cringed, certain she'd overstepped. Mr. Pembroke, standing discreetly by the doorway, coughed delicately, but Alistair didn't look offended. He looked thoughtful. He stared at the Monet as if seeing it for the first time. "An interesting perspective, Miss Holloway." He didn't agree or disagree, but something in his gaze had shifted. This was the first test, and she hadn't reacted as he'd expected. She hadn't gushed about its value. She'd spoken to its soul. Their subsequent meetings were a series of contrasts. He took her to a charity gala, a glittering affair teeming with the city's elite. Clara, in a borrowed dress that felt both elegant and alien, navigated the superficial conversations and predatory smiles with a quiet dignity that impressed Alistair. She didn't try to network or charm. She observed, her insights into the human drama around them surprisingly astute, delivered later with a dry wit that made him genuinely laugh, a rare, rusty sound. In turn, Clara invited him into her world, a visit to her cramped, wonderfully messy studio. Alistair, in his Savile Row suit, looked comically out of place amidst the paint-splattered easels and half-finished canvases. He picked up a small, unassuming Roman oil lamp she was restoring, his long fingers surprisingly gentle. "This has no significant market value," he observed. "No," Clara agreed, smiling, "but it lit someone's home 2,000 years ago. It heard their stories, their worries, their laughter. It's a tangible piece of a life. That's its value to me." He was visibly uncomfortable in the chaos of her studio, yet he stayed for 2 hours, asking her questions about her techniques, about the history of the objects she tended. He was a man used to controlling his environment, and here he was a guest, an observer. It was another test, this time for him, and he didn't flee. Alistair's subtle ally was Mr. Pembroke. The butler never spoke out of turn, but Clara noticed the slight softening of his austere features when she was present. The way he ensured her favourite tea was always available. Once, when Alistair had been particularly brusque after a stressful board meeting, Pembroke had caught Clara's eye and given a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent reassurance. He'd seen countless women pass through Alistair's life, most of them with an agenda as transparent as glass. Clara was different. The enemies were more insidious. Alistair's own deeply ingrained cynicism was a constant foe, whispering doubts about Clara's motives. Was she truly as guileless as she seemed? Or was this a more sophisticated, long-term play for his fortune? His past betrayal was a raw, unhealed wound, and trust was a language he was only slowly, painstakingly relearning. Then there were his business associates. Marcus Thorne, a rival billionaire with a vulpine grin and a reputation for scorched-earth tactics, had noticed Alistair's distraction. At a tense negotiation over a shared venture, Thorne had made a snide comment. "Heard you re-moonlighting as an art patron these days, Finch." Finch's esteemed company. Tell me, is it the man or his extensive collection that you find so captivating? Clara, flustered but determined not to show it, replied coolly, "Mr. Finch is a complex man, and his appreciation for art is certainly one of his more admirable qualities." The columnist's smile widened. "Indeed. And what qualities does he admire in you, my dear? Your eye for restoration, perhaps, or your ability to Restore a billionaire's flagging interest in acquisitions. The insinuation was clear, poisonous. Before Clara could formulate a response, Marcus Thorne reappeared, seemingly by chance. Don't badger the poor girl, Patricia. Can't you see she's merely inspired? We all find inspiration in different places. Some in art, others in opportunity. He winked at Clara, a gesture of lewd complicity. Alistair returned at that moment, his face a thundercloud. He'd overheard Thorne's last remark. Thorne, he said, his voice dangerously low, I believe your presence is required elsewhere, perhaps near the bar, where your usual lack of subtlety will be better appreciated. Thorne, unperturbed, merely smirked. Just admiring the view, Finch. You always did have an eye for unique assets. He sauntered off, leaving a trail of unease. The rest of the evening was strained. Alistair was preoccupied, his jaw tight. He barely spoke to Clara. Later, in the limousine, the same armored cocoon where they'd first met, but now filled with an icy tension, he finally broke the silence. What exactly did Thorne say to you? He demanded, his voice harsh. Clara, stung by his tone and the implications of his question, recounted the exchange, including the columnist's barbs. Alistair's expression hardened. You should have walked away. You shouldn't engage with people like that. And what was I supposed to do, Alistair? Clara retorted, her own temper flaring. Become invisible. They were baiting me, and you know it. They see you as a weakness, he bit out, the words like chips of ice, a way to get at me. The accusation hung in the air. Not they see our relationship as a weakness, but they see you as a weakness. The distinction was crucial and devastating. His old wound, his deep-seated paranoia about being used, about vulnerability being exploited, was gaping open. And do you? Clara asked, her voice trembling slightly. Do you see me as a weakness, Alistair? A liability? He didn't answer immediately, staring out the window at the blurred city lights. His silence was a confirmation more damning than any words. He was retreating, his emotional armor clanging shut. He was trying to protect her, yes, but in a way that was controlling, dismissive of her strength, and ultimately deeply distrustful. I knew this was a mistake, he finally said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth she had occasionally glimpsed. My world, it's not for you. Clara felt a cold dread seep into her heart. This was it. His fear had won. Your world, Alistair, or your prison, she whispered more to herself than to him. The death of Alistair's old self began that night, though he didn't realize it yet. He had pushed away the one person who had seen beyond the billionaire, who had touched the man beneath. In his attempt to shield himself from potential pain, he had inflicted it, and in doing so had chosen isolation once more. He dropped Clara at her apartment with a curt, formal goodbye, the chasm between them wider than ever. Clara's death was the shattering of her hopes for their connection. She had believed, perhaps naively, that their bond could transcend the vast differences in their lives. His lack of trust, his reversion to cynical suspicion, was a betrayal far deeper than any society gossip could inflict. She spent a sleepless night, tears of anger and sorrow tracing paths on her cheeks. She realized she wasn't just an art restorer. She was a woman of pride and self-worth, and she wouldn't be someone's liability or their beautifully curated possession. The next few days were a wasteland of silence. Alistair threw himself into his work with a vengeance, seeking solace in the cold, hard logic of numbers and deals. But the usual satisfaction eluded him. The penthouse felt colder, emptier than ever. The Brancusi sculpture mocked him with its polished, unyielding surface. Even his Vermeers, when he forced himself to look at them, seemed dull, lifeless. Clara's words echoed in his mind, like a magnificent bird in a gilded cage, not truly alive. It was Mr. Pembroke who inadvertently provided the catalyst for Alistair's rebirth. The butler, observing his employer's grim mood and unusual restlessness, finally ventured with extreme diffidence. "Begging your pardon, sir, but Miss Holloway left this for you. She asked me to give it to you when the moment seemed appropriate." He handed Alistair a small, flat package wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside was the little Roman oil lamp from her studio, now meticulously restored, its earthenware surface glowing with a soft, warm patina. Attached was a simple note, in Clara's elegant script. "Some things are worth preserving, Alistair. Not for their market value, but for the light they once held and might hold again. Trust is one of them. See." Alistair stared at the lamp, its humble beauty a stark contrast to the opulent emptiness surrounding him. The directness, the simple, profound truth of her message, cut through his layers of cynicism like a surgeon's scalpel. He saw, with blinding clarity, the monumental error he had made. His fear, his past, had driven him to betray the present, to wound the one person who had offered him genuine connection, untainted by his wealth. This was his moment of vulnerability absoluta. He wasn't just a billionaire who had made a tactical error. He was a man who had failed profoundly at something that mattered more than any deal. The old Alistair, the one who equated trust with weakness, who saw relationships as transactions, began to crumble. He picked up the phone, his hand surprisingly steady. He didn't call his lawyers or his security team or his PR department. He called Clara. It rang several times, each ring amplifying his anxiety. Finally, she answered, her voice cool, distant. "Clara," he began, his own voice rough, unfamiliar. I was wrong. I've been a fool. A blind, arrogant fool." There was no artifice, no carefully constructed apology, just raw, unvarnished truth. Can I see you?" There was a long pause on the other end. Then Clara's voice, still cautious but with a flicker of something less guarded. "Why, Alistair?" "Because," he said, looking at the small lamp in his hand, "I need to learn how to see the light again, and I think you're the only one who can teach me." Her rebirth was in that moment of choice. She could have hung up, protected her heart. But she heard the change in his voice, the cracking of his formidable armor. She understood that true connection wasn't about a fairy tale romance devoid of challenges, but about the willingness to face those challenges, to be vulnerable, and to forgive. "All right, Alistair," she said softly. "Let's talk." Their meeting was not in his sterile penthouse or her cluttered studio. Alistair suggested a small, quiet park near the river, a neutral ground. He arrived first, not in the armored limousine, but in a simple sedan driving himself. He looked different, still impeccably dressed, but the harsh lines around his eyes seemed softer, his usual ramrod posture slightly less rigid. He was holding the small Roman lamp. Clara approached him, her heart a mixture of hope and trepidation. They sat on a weathered wooden bench, the sounds of the city a muted backdrop to the quiet intensity between them. Alistair didn't offer excuses. He spoke of his father, of the betrayal that had shaped him, of the fear that had become his constant companion. He laid bare his vulnerabilities, the raw, unedited truth of his isolation and his profound regret. It wasn't a plea for pity, but an explanation, an offering of the broken pieces of himself. "I built walls, Clara," he said, his voice heavy with self-reproach, "and I almost let them imprison me for good. I confused control with strength and suspicion with wisdom. I hurt you, and in doing so I hurt myself more than I can say." Clara listened, her gaze unwavering. She saw the pain in his eyes, the genuine remorse. This wasn't the imperious billionaire. This was a man stripped bare, confronting his demons. Trust isn't easy, Alistair, she said gently, especially when you've been deeply wounded, but it's also not a one-time gift. It's a choice you make every day. Their Estrada de Volta, their new path, was not a swift or effortless reconciliation. It was a slow, deliberate process of rebuilding. Alistair had to earn back her trust, not with grand gestures of wealth, but with consistent actions that demonstrated his transformation. He started therapy, something his old self would have dismissed as an indulgent weakness. He began to actively dismantle some of the more isolating structures in his life, making more time for things that weren't purely about profit or power. He started to truly see his art collection, not as investments, but as legacies of human creativity. He even consulted Clara on redesigning the display in his penthouse, bringing in more natural light, creating spaces that felt more inviting, less like a vault. He found he enjoyed her insights, her passion. Clara, for her part, maintained her independence. She continued her restoration work, her life still grounded in her own passions. She didn't move into the penthouse or become a fixture on the society circuit. Their relationship found its rhythm in quiet evenings, shared meals, visits to museums, as equals, not as patron and protégé, and long walks where they simply talked. She learned to navigate the complexities of his world with a newfound confidence, no longer feeling like an outsider, but like a partner who brought her own unique strengths. The elixir for Alistair was profound. He discovered the richness of genuine human connection, the quiet strength of vulnerability. His wealth was still a part of him, but it no longer defined him or dictated his capacity for happiness. He began to explore philanthropy with a new sincerity, guided by Clara's empathetic compass, funding arts programs in underserved communities, establishing scholarships for young restorers. He found a purpose beyond the accumulation of more zeros in his bank account. He learned to delegate more at his company, trusting his team, realizing that he didn't need to control every variable to be successful. He even started to smile more, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. Clara's elixir was a deeper understanding of her own resilience and the transformative power of authentic connection. She had not fixed Alistair, but she had been the catalyst for his own journey of healing, and in doing so had found a love that was both profound and challenging. She hadn't lost herself in his world. Instead, she had helped him find a way to make his world a little more human. The cicatrices remained the memory of the auction night, the sting of his distrust, the near loss of what they were building. It served as a reminder that their relationship, forged in such disparate circumstances, would always require conscious effort, open communication, and a willingness to confront their respective fears. One late autumn afternoon, about a year after their first encounter, they were walking along the riverbank. A sudden, unexpected shower began to fall, not a ferocious deluge like the first time, but a soft, persistent rain. Alistair, without a word, slipped off his jacket and held it over both their heads, a shared makeshift umbrella. They huddled underneath, laughing, the rain pattering gently on the fabric. Clara looked up at him, at the man who had once hidden from the world in an armored limousine, now standing with her in the rain, his eyes full of a warmth she knew was reserved for her. The city hummed around them, but it felt different now, not a cold, impersonal machine, but a place of shared moments, of possibilities. "You know," she said, a teasing glint in her eye, "for a man who values efficiency, this isn't a very effective way to stay dry." Alistair smiled, a real, unreserved smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He pulled her a little closer. "Perhaps," he said, his voice softer now, stripped of its former austerity. "But some things are more important than efficiency, Clara. Some things are worth getting a little wet for." He no longer needed the armor of his limousine, nor the fortress of his wealth, to shield him. He had found something far more valuable, a connection that was real, a trust that was earned, and a love that had, against all odds, found its way through the storm. The forgotten umbrella had been a small, mundane accident, but it had opened the door to an extraordinary transformation, proving that even the most fortified hearts could find their way back to the light, one rainy day at a time. The elixir wasn't a magical potion, but the hard-won peace of two souls who had found their way to each other, navigating the complexities of their worlds with courage and an enduring belief in the power of human connection.